Hi everybody, it's Cindy at Upcycle Design Lab. Today I'm going to be doing another tutorial on fusing glass in your microwave. I'm using this Fuseworks microwave kiln. It's got it, I've never really showed it before, but this is what it looks like out of the box. This is the actual working surface here. Anyway, I'm not going to do a lot of detailed explanations of how to use the kiln. It's easy enough to follow the instructions once you have one. What I'm going to talk about today are 4 basic techniques that I've used to make a lot of different jewelry shapes. Okay, before we get into the techniques, I want to talk about 2 terms that I actually just made up. I've used my kiln about 50 times now, so I'm considering myself an expert. I'm totally joking. But there might actually be terms for this, but I just made up terms, I don't know. I'm calling it full fuse and soft fuse. So a full fuse is something that gives you a very smooth finish, like this. You can see it's very rounded on top, and it's all one piece. These 2 things started out as the same shapes. And this is what I'm calling a partial fuse. Not a partial, a soft fuse. Where you can still sort of see the definition of the shapes. There were 2 squares that started out. And the full fuse is easier to achieve than the soft fuse, just because there's such a small amount of time between it fusing like this and it fusing like this. So you have to really watch it if you want to get this soft fuse. But depending on what kind of finish you're trying to get, this can be a really fun way to fuse the glass rather than just letting it go all the way to a full fuse. Here are the pieces side by side so you can see what I'm talking about with the full fuse and the soft fuse. Both of these shapes were 2 squares stacked together before the fusing process. This picture is an example of what the piece would look like at a soft fuse. The 2 front pieces are particularly well fused, and you can kind of see the back piece, though one square has slid off, so that's not going to be a perfect circle when it's done. This picture is after another 30 seconds of firing in the microwave, and you can see that the pieces are smoothing out even a little bit more. I would still call this a soft fuse. And here we've gotten to a full fuse. You can see especially the 2 pieces on the right side have a very bright glow, and they are smooth and round on the top. Alright, the first shape is what I'm calling the circle dot, which is made by cutting 2 similar sized squares and stacking them on top of each other in a staggered pattern. And because I'm working with recycled glass, mostly bottle glass, all of it has a curve to it. So one of the things when I'm making the circle dots, I try to make sure that the squares are stacked together with the curves facing each other, so they kind of curve around each other. These are some examples of these circle dots that I made. As you can see, they turn out really nice and smooth if you take them all the way to a full fuse. So anytime you want to make the squares into circle dots, you're going to want to take it to a full fuse. This one has a little bit rougher edges. I don't know if you can see that. I probably could have used it just a tiny bit longer. This was an experimental piece that I stacked the 2 squares, and then I put a tiny piece of brown shard on the top to sort of make a tiger's eye. And this is just an example of what happens when the squares slide off of each other. You get kind of an oblong shape. Alright, the second technique is squares and triangles. And this first example is really a hideous project. Both of them turned out really poorly, but they started out looking exactly the same. So it's a good example of the full fuse versus the soft fuse, which in this case I like the soft fuse a lot better than the full fuse. They're both still really ugly, but it's still a good example of how you can get very different effects using the full fuse and the soft fuse. Here's another example of this is a full fuse, I don't know. I guess you can kind of see it. It looks kind of dark, but these were blue triangles with green triangles on the top, and they were fully fused, so you can see they're very flat on the top, and the green doesn't really show up unless you've got a lot of nice light showing through the back. So I'm not sure entirely how I feel about these. I think sometimes when you're using a dark color on a dark color, it's better to do a softer fuse, which is this version. These started out looking pretty much the same, but you can see that the soft fuse doesn't round out the shape quite as much, but it shows more definition as far as the two colors. The other thing about a soft fuse versus a hard or a full fuse is kind of counterintuitive. You would think that the full fused piece would be less sharp, but actually by the time it fuses down to the full fuse, this soft fuse piece has a lot of rounded edges, but it has no really pointed sharp pieces. Even this very tip is not very sharp. The full fused piece, the bottom edge, because everything smooths out, but the bottom edge gets very pointed and sharp. So full fused pieces generally need a little bit of sanding down, whereas the soft fused pieces usually don't have too sharp of edges, and they have more definition to the piece. Here are just a few more examples of squares and triangles. This piece is a yellow on brown full fused piece. You can see it's very flat on the top, but it started as two squares stacked on top of each other. And like I said, the edges are a little bit rough because it's a full fuse. These turned out really cute, I think. They were two little triangles, yellow triangles with some blue added, and they too are full fused. You can see they're very smooth on the top, and they'll need a little bit of sanding down to finish them. And then this is I was trying to do a partial fuse here. This is a blue square with a white square on, or a clear square on top, and you can kind of see a little bit of color definition. And this is an example of how you can take the soft fuse, and there's quite a few different ranges of soft fuse that you can do, because this is almost a full fuse. I fused it a little bit longer than I wanted to. Alright, the third shape I'm going to talk about is the teardrop shape. It's very similar to the triangles and the squares. The main difference is in how you cut the shape. The squares and the triangles are straight cuts. These teardrop shapes actually are cut to be a little more rounded. So this first one was a clear, starting with a triangle, and then I trimmed off with the nippers, I trimmed off the corners a little bit and put a green dot or a green teardrop in the center. This is a full fuse. You can see it's very flat on the top, and the bottom edge is fairly sharp, as stated before. but it's just a single layer of glass on this piece, and so I've cut the more rounded shape. Teardrops can be a lot of different shapes. This is a much longer. It started as a rectangle shape with yellow and just a brown piece on top. It's also fully fused, you can see. But for cutting purposes, I trimmed off the top a little bit to make it more tapered and rounded off the bottom to make it a little more rounded shape. This last piece started out as a teardrop as well. It was a yellow teardrop shape, very similar to this shape, with a green piece on top. And actually 2 minutes into the firing, I checked it, and this yellow piece had broken into about 5 separate pieces. So I pulled it out of the microwave and used some tweezers to kind of piece it back together. And it actually turned out kind of interesting. I really kind of like the way it turned out. It's a soft fuse. You can see there's more definition to the pieces. And there are some, you can still see sort of some of the cracks where it broke apart, but it made a rather interesting shape. The last technique is constructed shapes. This necklace is actually a constructed shape. It's a series of small squares placed in a circle with another set of squares on top, bridging the gaps in between the circles. So with using squares and rectangles, you can come up with a lot of different constructed shapes. These crosses are constructed shapes. And this is a really good example of a fully fused constructed triangle using, you can see it's fully fused. And it was 3 pieces of green rectangle shape and then 3 pieces of square yellow. And the earrings are a partial fuse, and they are just stacked squares. So you can see there's a lot of shape definition. So the constructed shapes, you could pretty much make any shape you want to, just building it sort of as a 2-layer piece and designing the shape and playing with different colors. There's a lot of different things you can do with it. So far I've just sort of made some rings, crosses, and the triangles. But I've been thinking about making letters and all kinds of different shapes. So with constructed shapes, there's a lot of variety that you can experiment with. These last pictures are just sort of collages of the pieces that I've made. You can see the earrings across the top and the pendants across the bottom, starting with from left to right, starting with what the shapes look like when they were cut out. And they're on a 1-inch grid, so you can kind of get an idea of the size of the piece. And then the second picture is how they were stacked. The third picture is what they looked like after they were fused. And then obviously the last picture is once they were made into jewelry.